When you talk about heavy metal, one of the first bands that comes to mind is Judas Priest. They helped pave the way for the rest of the metal bands that came after them. They are known as one of the pioneers of the new wave of British heavy metal, and they are a major influence on other genres such as thrash metal, power metal, and glam metal. But did you know that the band started back in 1969 and released some of the most influential albums of the 70s? So in this video, I will focus on the evolution of Judas Priest in the 70s, from their debut album, Rocka Rolla, to the album Killing Machine, and we will see how they went from being a heavy rock band to the leather and studded metal band that we know today. Judas Priest formed in Birmingham, England in 1969. Back then, the lineup was completely different. You had lead singer Al Atkins, Brian Bruno Staplehill on bass, John Perry on guitars, and John Fessa Partridge on drums. Now, the story is going to sound like a tragedy right off the bat, because one of the members, John Perry, decided to end his life at the young age of 18. You would think the story would end here, but this is where it actually begins, because they auditioned a few new guitarists. One of them was K.K. Downing, but he didn't get the gig. So they gave the position to Ernest Chataway, who had played in a band called Earth, or you may know them by their popular name, which is Black Sabbath. The band then recorded a 2-song demo and landed a 3-album recording contract with a small record label, but then the label went out of business and the band broke up in 1970. Now you may be wondering, why is any of this relevant? So far, the video is not going anywhere. It's important to know because this version of the band gave birth to the name Judas Priest, which was taken from a Bob Dylan song called The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. Now, why is this important? Because Al Atkins decided to form another band called Freight, and this band had K.K. Downing and Ian Hill, and they soon decided to change the name back to Judas Priest. So this was the official birth of the band. So after many members came and went, it was now time for Rob Halford to join the band, who happened to be the brother of Ian Hill's girlfriend. They started to play a few live shows, and they were discovered by a label called Gull. This label suggested adding another member. He was Glenn Tipton. Now it's time to record their debut album. This one had a sound that was different than what we would come to know of this band. They were just starting out and finding their sound, which they would later solidify in their sophomore album, which I will get to soon. The album was released on September 6, 1974, and it just celebrated 50 years. It was produced by Roger Bain, who had produced the first 3 Black Sabbath albums. The album had 2 different album covers. The first cover was a bottle cap cover, but then there was another cover on the reissue, which has an image that was later used for a TurboGrafx-16 video game called Ballistics. That was a console, by the way. I used to have that one in the early 90s. It was pretty cool. But anyway, the album had most of the core lineup of Judas Priest, who were Rob Halford, Glenn Tipton, K.K. Downing, Ian Hill, and drummer John Hinch, who only played on this album. The band had some technical problems when they were in the studio. Glenn Tipton had just joined the band when production began, so his contributions were the title track and Run of the Mill. He wrote a few more songs, though. They were Tyrant, Epitaph, and Ripper, but producer Roger Bain rejected them because he felt they were not commercial enough. But you'll be hearing about those songs in the next chapter when I talk about the sophomore album. There was another song that they had been playing live for many years called Whiskey Woman, but Roger Bain also rejected that one. But don't worry, that song eventually became the song Victim of Changes, which will be on the next album. They also appeared on a British television show called The Old Grey Whistle Test in 1975, and they performed 2 songs from the album, Rocka Rolla and Dreamer Deceiver, which would be on their next album. Despite being on the show, the album did not sell well. It actually flopped. This is an example of a band that got off to a rocky start, but I like this album. It's not a heavy album, but there are some good classic rock songs on here. First 2 tracks, One for the Road and Rocka Rolla, are great tracks. Some of the other songs sound like classic rock. I like the song Cheater. There's some cool bluesy guitar riffs, and Rob plays the harmonic on that one. But let's continue to the next album. This is the album Sad Wings of Destiny. This is where many people believe is the true birth of the band Judas Priest. The album has the same lineup as before, but with Alan Moore replacing John Hinch on drums. The album was released on March 26, 1976 through Gull Records. This is considered one of the first true heavy metal albums. They took the sound of bands like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Queen, and they took it to another level. This is one of those albums that didn't sell very well at first, but it has created a lasting legacy. The album has some of the best songs, such as Victim of Changes, a song that was inspired by Led Zeppelin's Black Dog. It's about a woman who was an alcoholic and ends up losing her man to another man. The song also features a few a cappella sections that really show off Rob Halford's range. There's another song called The Ripper, which was about the serial killer Jack the Ripper. The song was inspired by the band Queen and considered one of the best songs of the album. The song is also featured in the 2011 film Bad Teacher with Cameron Diaz. I remember one day I'm watching that on Netflix or something, and that song comes on. I hear the riff, and I'm thinking that's pretty cool. I remember that from the Judas Priest album. There's also a Dreamer Deceiver, and that shows off Rob's ability to sing in a lower range and give off some of his high screams. And then Deceiver, it's another classic, which is one of the first examples of speed metal. There was also the track Tyrant, which is the classic, shows up their progressive side with lots of sections and tempo changes. There are some tracks that have some big riffs, such as Genocide, which could be compared to songs like Woman from Tokyo and Burn by Deep Purple. Then there was a softer song called Epitaph, which has some piano inspired by the band Queen. Overall, it's a great album. I have more I can say about it, but let's move on to the next album. The next album is Sin After Sin. This one was released on April 8th, 1977. This was produced by Roger Glover, the bass player for Deep Purple. It was released through Columbia, and this is their major label debut. This album had the same lineup as before, but with drummer Simon Phillips replacing Alan Moore. One of the most popular songs from this album is their cover of the Joan Baez song Diamonds and Rust. The decision to record this cover was encouraged by Roger Glover as it had commercial potential. This was also their most successful album at that time. It reached number 23 on the UK albums chart, although it had not yet made their mark in the United States. This album was also very influential. It features double bass drumming and some faster rhythms that would later lay the foundation for thrash metal in the 80s. This also features the song Dissident Aggression. The song was so influential that the band Slayer would cover it 11 years later on their album South of Heaven. And I'll be honest with you all, the first time I heard this song was back in 1988 when Slayer played it. I didn't even realize it was a Judas Priest cover back then, but I found out like many years later. But speaking of albums from 1988, according to Scott Ian of Anthrax, the band was inspired by the production on this album when they recorded State of Euphoria in 1988. This album also has some standout tracks like Sinner, which has some classic heavy metal guitar riffs, and Rob Halford shows off his high range during the chorus. They also showed off their softer side on Last Rose of Summer. One thing I like about the 70s was bands didn't always stay in their lane. This sounds like a typical song that you would hear on classic rock radio. I'm surprised this one was never released as a single, as I can see it being a radio hit. There's also the song Raw Deal, which has lyrics that have, well, some people have said that it kind of has hints about his sexual orientation or it's his coming out song, but that's kind of under debate. Then the song Here Comes the Tears, another soft ballad with Rob Halford showing off his softer vocals. Again, this is one of the rare times you hear acoustic guitars in a Judas Priest song. But overall, I like the album. It might not be as strong as Sad Wings, but I think it ranks high in their discography. They released an album some say is one of the best and one of the defining moments in the evolution of heavy metal. I'm talking about Stained Class, their fourth studio album, which was released on February 10, 1978 through Columbia Records. Their lineup was mostly the same, but by now you will see that they have been changing their drummers on a regular basis, but don't worry, the drummer that they found would stay for the next 3 albums. I'm talking about Les Binks. This album also has something unique. It's their first with the Judas Priest logo that we all know today. So before, when I said Sad Wings of Destiny was the album where they solidified their sound, well, Stained Class is the album where they took it to the next level and set the blueprint for heavy metal in the 80s. The album has many notable tracks, such as the song Exciter, which is also often considered to be one of the first thrash metal songs, or if not, a big influence on it. There are also some controversy on the album. They did a cover song of Better by You, Better by Me by Spooky Tooth. But back in 1978, there were two teenagers who entered into an agreement to end their lives. One of them dies, the other survives, but dies years later. The parents blamed the band for putting subliminal messages in the song. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but it was just an example how heavy metal music was this big, scary thing back then. But then there was the song Beyond the Realms of Death, which was a heavy metal power ballad. Not the first time a metal band released a power ballad, but this is one of the best ballads in the history of heavy metal. Let's talk about another album. This is when they're starting to get popular. And this album has two names. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. I'm talking about Killing Machine or Hellbent for Leather. So the album was released in November 1978 through Columbia Records. This was the album that showed their complete transformation from a rock band to the leather and studs heavy metal band. Even though the sound may have been a bit commercial than Stained Glass or Stained Class, it's still a solid album. So you're wondering why the two album titles. So I guess the band wanted to play it safe after the controversy with the last album. So the American version was called Hellbent for Leather, and it was released on February 28, 1979 in the United States. They felt the title Killing Machine was too strong for the American audience, and they didn't want to imply that they were murderers. Like, I know it kind of sounds over the top, but keep in mind it was 1978. As I said before, the band changed their sound and image, and they did this because punk rock and new wave were starting to get popular around that time. There was also the rise of the new wave of the British heavy metal movement. Judas Priest were a big influence on it, but not necessarily a part of it. They solidified that transformation by having Rob Halford ride a Harley Davidson motorcycle on stage. And the album has some of the classics, such as Hellbent for Leather, which is a heavy metal anthem, a cover song of the Green Manalishi and the Two-Pronged Crown, originally by Fleetwood Mac. And I've always thought this is a solid album, even though I feel there are a few weaker tracks, like the song Evening Star. I never liked that song that much, but otherwise, a solid album. So now let's talk about their legacy. So these albums really created a legacy. They would continue to release albums throughout the 80s. They released British Steel in 1980, and this helped them gain mainstream success in the US. And this album is like the definition of like what is heavy metal. But another factor in their success was their stable lineup, which, as you have seen, remained intact for the most part, with the exception of the drummers who kind of came and went. And they also influenced many bands. For example, Iron Maiden came onto the scene at the start of the decade. They're considered one of their peers. Metallica came out in 1983. Even though they were a thrash metal band, they have cited Judas Priest as one of their influences. Then the band Saxon, who came around at the end of the 70s, they had a sound very similar to Judas Priest. And even today, they're releasing albums that are arguably as good as the ones that Judas Priest are releasing. Then there were some other bands like the glam metal bands that were part of the new wave of British heavy metal, or one of them was. I'm talking about Motley Crue and Def Leppard. Both of these bands, they kind of sounded like Judas Priest when they started out, but then they kind of evolved their sound into more of a commercial sound. Then there were bands that came out years later, like Primal Fear, who sound a lot like Judas Priest. They have dual guitar harmonies and high-pitched vocals, and it kind of shows how Judas Priest also helped influence the power metal genre. So that is all. If you want to see how I rank all their albums, check out this video right here. This one only goes up to Firepower, so I'm actually due for an updated ranking video. So subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of my new videos. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, tier lists, and classic album reviews. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.